Order. Good morning. I am pleased to convene the Senate Subcommittee on Surface Transportation and Merchant Marine Infrastructure, Safety, and Security for our second hearing, which is entitled Keeping Goods Moving. To grow the economy and create new jobs, we need an efficient and reliable intermodal transportation network. Today's hearing allows us to explore this issue with a particular focus on infrastructure and maintaining operations at our nation's ports. America's intermodal transportation network is the foundation upon which U.S. businesses along all segments of the supply chain produce goods and get them to market. At our last hearing, Cabela's outlined how disruptions or inefficiencies along our nation's just-in-time shipping network cost companies through lost sales, increased costs, and poor customer service. Deepwater ports represent a key element of the U.S. transportation network and are vital to our economic growth. In fact, America's seaports often serve as the key connection point for all modes of transportation. Our West Coast ports alone move 12.5% of U.S. GDP per year. A shutdown of America's West Coast ports, even for a short period of time, would have devastating economic consequences. According to a recent report by the National Retail Federation and the National Association of Manufacturers, in the most severe case, a 20-day West Coast ports closure would disrupt 405,000 jobs, reduce U.S. GDP by almost $50 billion, and cost the U.S. economy $2.5 billion per day. I've heard from businesses and consumers in my state expressing grave concerns about service disruptions at West Coast ports. Just last week, my office heard from an Omaha-based company that manufactures electric conductors with inputs from Asia. This company is seeing its import time frame double and costs triple because of current slowdowns. For many businesses, changing shipping routes or modes is cost prohibitive. Unfortunately, whether they export agricultural goods or import retail, businesses are being forced to opt for air freight or are rerouting projects to avoid losing market share due to missed shipments. Port congestion also impacts truckers and freight rail, as well as the competitiveness of the ports themselves. Everyone has a stake in seeing the ongoing negotiations between PMA and ILWU resolved quickly. Members of Congress and the administration must pay close attention to these ongoing negotiations and the economic impact of service disruption at our ports. This is particularly important as we face the potential for ports on both coasts to be negotiating simultaneously in 2018. Which is when the current East Coast labor contract expires. I'm pleased that today's panel will represent a wide array of perspectives on the effect of recent disruptions in our nation's supply chain. I'm eager to hear further details from our panelists on the challenges that slowdowns at our nation's West Coast ports have posed to their industries and their consumers. I'm also looking forward to hearing about opportunities for Congress, state, and local governments and the private sector to work toward modernizing and enhancing our nation's ports infrastructure for businesses, workers, and consumers. We need to explore the policy options to support port growth and future volumes of freight to keep goods moving. I'd like to now invite my colleague, Senator Blumenthal, to make any opening remarks. Senator.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, Senator Fischer. Thanks to our witnesses for being here today, coming long distances and contributing your insights to one of the critical challenges that our country faces. Not always the most glamorous or noticed, but one of the most profoundly important to our economy, to jobs, and to our quality of life. So we thank you for being here. In the next remainder of this decade, the Department of Transportation estimates that freight will grow at least 10% in volume. not to mention the value of that volume to our economy. So far from diminishing the importance of moving goods, the topic which brings us here today will only increase dramatically. And that estimate, in my view, is a conservative one. No individual part of the country, no city or town, and certainly no region is an island. All depend on transportation working together to move goods. We tend to focus on passengers, as we did last week in the tragic collision in Valhalla, New York, a tragedy that was preventable and avoidable with proper safety procedures. The same is true in moving goods, in moving freight. Safety has to be made #1 priority. But we're all dependent on freight transportation just as we are on moving people. Moving goods is equally important. We all depend on all of the modes of transportation, all the types of transit, whether it's roads and bridges, rail, water, all working together and all fulfilling their vital functions. So I join in the hope that the parties to the West Coast ports dispute can find a reasonable, mutually agreeable solution as fast as possible. Time is not on our side, and that the businesses impacted by the slowdown, including many in Connecticut, are able to weather this time and the impact economically. But looking beyond this immediate issue are the broader challenges of investing and making sure that we build the infrastructure that is vital to moving goods and people. Just as one example, Connecticut has a freight infrastructure that is very much in need of that investment, upgrading certain sections of our freight rail network so they can accommodate 286,000-pound weights in moving goods and services by rail, which is the North American rail network standard, is very, very important. Most freight railroads in the country are able to sustain freight cars weighing 286,000 pounds, and this weight limit includes the weight of the car plus about 110 tons of cargo, or 220,000 pounds. If Connecticut doesn't upgrade its weight limits, then our state could become a freight island. But of course, if we are a freight island, the rest of America can't reach us moving goods. And that's just one example of how clogged arteries can stymie economic progress and job creation. So I'm very much looking forward to the testimony that we're going to hear today and to hopefully the initiatives that it will enable us to take in the interests of all America. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Welcome to the panel today. I appreciate you taking time out of your schedules to be here at this hearing and provide the senators with more information on this very important topic. I would like to get right to it. So our first witness is Mr. Norman Basek. Mr. Basek is the Vice President of International Sales of Cargill. So welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Fischer and members of the committee and subcommittee for inviting me to testify. Trade maximizes the value of products U.S. farmers and ranchers produce and our employees process because we're able to sell them to the domestic and international markets where they have the most value. This creates the best opportunities for Cargill, our customers, our farmer and rancher suppliers, our hardworking employees, and the communities where we operate. Ports are an integral part of a dependable supply chain. Let me outline the beef and pork supply chain I work with every day and detail the challenges that occur when there are problems with product flow through the ports. Cargill procures livestock from farmers and ranchers to be processed into fresh beef and pork in our plants located predominantly in Nebraska, Kansas, Texas, Iowa, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Colorado, and California. Customers from around the world depend on high-quality, fresh U.S. beef and pork to sell in supermarkets, restaurants, and food processing plants. Fresh meat has a relatively short shelf life. It must be quickly packaged and shipped in temperature-controlled trucks, rail cars, or containers to ensure product integrity and safety and to allow enough shelf life to sell or process once the product arrives. Under normal circumstances, a container of fresh pork destined for Asia usually arrives with more than 25 days shelf life. The industry is currently experiencing delays of 2 to 3 weeks on chilled product due to the congestion in West Coast ports. With this delay, our Asian customers cannot count on a dependable supply of U.S. beef and pork, so they're canceling orders and are looking to suppliers in Chile, Australia, and the European Union to meet their needs. Yesterday, Japanese customers canceled next week's chilled pork shipments. I assume many of our competitors are facing similar cancellations. Needless to say, the current situation has created a tremendous amount of uncertainty. Today, the industry is faced with 3 choices. First, continue to ship product despite the current uncertainty. This can result in shorter shelf life, an increased risk of potential spoilage, and even complete product loss. Second, we can air freight the product at a tremendous expense, often 3 to 5 times the normal cost. Or third, don't manufacture export products and adjust operations and procurement accordingly. If you take nothing else away from my testimony today, understand that any of these choices result in negative effects to everyone in the chain, in particular farmers, ranchers, customers, and plant employees. Today, about 10% of U.S. beef and 25% of U.S. pork is exported. The U.S. Meat Export Federation estimates that the global demand for U.S. beef and pork will reach 17.6 billion pounds in 2024. That's up 50% for beef and 42% for pork, with most of that growth coming from the Pacific Rim. Future growth to serve these markets depends on an effective, efficient, and reliable supply chain capable of moving 162,000 incremental containers per year. For reference, this is enough to provide 29.2 billion more 4-ounce servings of beef or pork. Our nation's advantage has always been having a fair, robust, competitive transportation system that ensures we can compete in the global market. We must look at our situation not simply as manufacturers, shippers, labor, and capital, but through the lens of global competition. We ignore it at our collective peril. Ports, where the goods we make are loaded and exported for the world's consumers. Functioning ports are imperative from both a labor and operational perspective. When ports don't operate, the supply chain backs up, causing long-term problems for us, our industry, our farmer and rancher suppliers, our customers, and our employees. We ask you to take the steps needed to address the challenges I've outlined today so that we can continue helping the world thrive by meeting the needs of consumers around the globe. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Besek. Ms. Katie Farmer. Ms. Farmer is the Vice President of Consumer Products at BNSF. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Fischer and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here to discuss BNSF's perspective on the importance of our nation's ports to the U.S. supply chain. I'd like to begin by explaining rail's role in the international supply chain. Intermodal is the movement of shipping containers and trucks by rail, combined with a shorter truck movement at one or both ends. Its growth over the last decade is attributable to a number of factors, including fuel efficiency, highway congestion, trade growth, and truck driver shortages. There are 2 kinds of intermodal movements on a freight railroad. The first is domestic intermodal, which is the movement of 53-foot long containers or trailers within the U.S. The second is international intermodal, in which goods manufactured overseas are shipped in 20 and 40-foot long containers. These containers arrive on a container ship at a port, and those that are not distributed locally are loaded onto trains on dock or trucked a short distance to an off-dock or near-dock intermodal yard, where they are sorted and loaded for movement to markets in the interior of the country. The containers are owned by the steamship lines, and we work together to balance the flows of eastbound traffic and match back the empties with full loads of U.S. goods westbound to a ship, destined for Asia or other international markets. Last year on our railroad, we handled post-recession record volume levels of freight. Our service was challenged, and we did not deliver the service that customers have come to expect from BNSF. We have moved quickly to add capacity and implemented a record $4 billion capital program in 2013, followed by a $5.5 billion program in 2014, and we have announced a $6 billion capital budget this year. With this investment, we have permanently expanded the capacity of our network, which we believe will continue to maintain the U.S. supply chain advantage. The San Pedro Bay Port Complex, comprised of the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, is the busiest container port complex in the Western Hemisphere and a top gateway for U.S. trade with Asia. BNSF transports more than half the international shipments that go by rail out of these ports, and about 75% of these units carried by BNSF are loaded on dock. The remaining are handled off dock at BNSF's Hobart Yard in East Los Angeles. The facility is 24 miles by highway from the ports. BNSF has been working for well over a decade to build a near-dock facility only 4 miles from the ports, called the Southern California International Gateway, or SCIG, which would be the greenest intermodal rail facility ever constructed and eliminate millions of truck miles on the I-710 freeway between the ports and downtown Los Angeles. Our efforts to permit and build this facility have been challenged for years by local opposition groups, and permit is currently tied up in the courts. We think this project will create operational efficiencies for the ports. West Coast ports are facing challenges due to congestion. Growing freight volumes are not the whole story, however, since overall freight levels through the West Coast ports have not returned to levels since seen before the recession. There are several factors that are contributing to growing congestion at these ports, including inadequate port infrastructure needed to handle the larger ships, limited infrastructure adjacent to the ports, operating restrictions from local communities, as well as operating inefficiencies. But by far and away, the most disruptive aspect to the supply chain over the last several months has been the reduction in port productivity as a result of the ongoing negotiations between the PMA and the ILWU. Port productivity has declined by as much as 50% during this period. The result is year-over-year reductions in BNSF's eastbound weekly train counts of as much as 20 to 30 trains per week, carrying a minimum of 250 containers that are not being processed through the supply chain. This also impacts the return movement of freight westbound for exports. This is causing significant delays and increased costs for our customers. BNSF has taken numerous actions to serve its customers and ensure the fluidity of our network in the face of these challenges, including establishing controls at our intermodal facilities and equipment management. During the 11-day shutdown of port operations that occurred in 2002, freight permanently migrated away from the West Coast. This is certainly a potential long-term consequence from the current situation. Congress can play a role in keeping goods moving through sound infrastructure policy and permitting reform. My written testimony details BNSF's thoughts in those areas. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Farmer. Next, we have Dr. Walter Chemesis. Dr. Chemesis is the chief economist at Moffitt & Nichol. Welcome.
Good morning. Is that right? Okay. So, good morning. It is well recognized that international trade is increasingly important to the U.S. economy, and that this trade mostly utilizes ocean-going vessels, particularly container vessels, due to the versatility of containers for handling a range of cargoes, from dry goods to refrigerated goods, refrigerated perishables to liquids and gases. And ports have an important role in the movement of overseas freight because they are major intermodal exchange points, transferring cargo between ships, trucks, and rail. They are essentially the very embodiment of intermodalism. And ocean liners are adapting to growing trade volumes, and I would agree with Senator Blumenthal that the estimates for trade volume growth are probably low, and we should likely see much higher growth rates, provided that the infrastructure is there. The ocean liners are responding to this to not only the larger trade volumes, but also to rising fuel costs and to stricter environmental impact regulations by investing in larger vessels. The larger vessels mean more cargo on fewer ships and in fewer ports, because the time it takes to load and unload the ships is time that vessels do not earn revenues, and given the cost of these very large ships, it is important that they minimize the time that they spend stationary, particularly sitting in ports. The ports are adapting to this change in the global ocean vessel fleet. They are investing in dredging the access channels, investing in dredging the berths, in removing air draft restrictions. They have been acquiring larger ship-to-shore cranes that have greater reach and much greater lift capacity. They are densifying their terminals so you can stack the containers higher, and also by automation. The investments made by the ocean liners and the ports are often not matched by the landside investments outside the port's gates. Larger vessels and increasing cargo handling capacity at ports has created congestion problems in port gateways around the world and in some parts of the U.S. in locations where landside planning and investing is not exactly in line with what's happening on the water side, being the ports and what's happening in the access channels and the global fleet of vessels. So the shorter-term issues, such as the severe weather last year and the transition of ocean carriers moving away from providing chassis to their customers and allowing the financial sector to step in and lease these, has not been very smooth. And to some extent, this has impacted the effect of the larger vessels on congestion issues. And to that, we would include the productivity losses that have occurred at the ports during the contract negotiations. But from my perspective, we see the shorter-term issues as masking some of these longer-term trends driven by the larger vessels, and therefore causing concern about the long-term congestion problems that we would expect to see in the U.S. supply chain. It is likely that foreign ports in locations where intermodalism characterizes freight movement and planning will be gaining at the expense of U.S. ports and therefore the U.S. logistics industry. And to sum up, I believe that failure to cut costs across U.S. ports, by which I do not mean not just cutting costs in ways that create competition between U.S. ports, but rather cutting costs for the entire port system is required. Otherwise, U.S. ports will not be the winners in competition with the foreign ports. The spotlight on this is on the inland segment of the product flow path, on railroad lines in order to improve service to markets close to the port, and truck freightways to improve access to markets further away. To defend our exports and imports, we need to focus our attention on the inland segments of the product flow path, on the railroad lines, the grade crossings, the container transfer facilities, and for trucks, we need to start thinking about dedicated freightways. These types of investments will make U.S. exports more competitive. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kemisis. Next, we have Mr. John Gruling. Mr. Gruling is a board member of the Coalition for America's Gateways and Trade Corridors. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity. Today I'm representing both the Will County Center for Economic Development and the Coalition for America's Gateways and Trade Corridors, which is a diverse group of 60 public and private organizations dedicated to increasing federal investment in America's multimodal freight infrastructure. I'm also here as the CEO of the Will County Center for Economic Development. Our responsibility today is marketing the largest inland international container port in North America. Will County is crossed by 6 Class I railroads, 5 interstate highways, several commercial water ports on our nation's largest inland waterway. Last year, we processed over 3 million containers containing $65 billion worth of goods that are grown, manufactured, assembled, and delivered throughout the United States and the world. Our first and last mile infrastructure requirements today total $3.6 billion of new investment just in our county, and that does not include bringing our existing road infrastructure up to a state of good repair. Our needs extend far beyond roads. Increased utilization of freight by rail, as we've heard, is resulting in more at-grade rail crossings, and it's impacting commerce and public safety. We need, at the very local level, more grade separation structures and first and last mile interstate connectors to accommodate the freight of the future. The growth of freight has been stated. We believe by 2045, that increase will be about 45%, putting more pressure on both existing and future infrastructure for freight. Meanwhile, 95% of the international consumers are now outside of the United States. So being at the beginning and the end of a major global supply chain, U.S. companies have to understand, and the government needs to understand, that we need good infrastructure to reach those markets. U.S. government infrastructure investment as a percentage of GDP is currently less than 2%. Our trade partners, our biggest ones, Canada, China, Mexico, are spending 2 to 5 times more than that on their infrastructure. And it can't be just one mode that we're focused on when we talk about funding infrastructure. We have to look at all modes, and we need to make those modes work better together. Rail, truck, air, and water are today the key components of the global supply chain. The global situation is getting worse in a lot of respects, but we have the opportunity to take advantage of what's going on internationally in the economy. The Coalition for America's Gateways and Trade Corridors asked Congress to take the following steps in the upcoming surface transportation authorization. First, we would like you to establish a freight program containing dedicated and flexible funding. Freight should not compete with other mobility needs. It's integral to other mobility needs. Freight movement occupies a special place in our transportation system as the element supporting commerce, competitiveness, and that all-important word, jobs. We should have a dedicated funding, such as a freight trust fund, that is committed to stoking our economic engine by improving efficiency, safety, reliability, and speed at which goods are moved. Second, fund at a minimum level of $2 billion a year a competitive multimodal freight infrastructure grant program. Projects of national and regional significance or similar freight-specific competitive grant program is needed to prioritize federal funding of projects that meet certain performance criteria to advance economic goals of this country. By prioritizing projects, we can identify important public benefits as well as non-federal support. A $2 billion grant program could leverage many times that amount in private investment in infrastructure. Third, ensure robust public investment in all modes. Where public benefit is derived, public investment must be made. It is often where modes come together that public assistance is needed to close the funding gaps. Examples include highway rail grade crossings, rail spurs to access cargo, logistics or transfer facilities, tunnel and bridges for port access, and border crossing capacity enhancements. Finally, modify the National Freight Transportation Policy to make it multimodal. Create an Office of Intermodalism in the U.S. DOT Secretary's Office and give freight the significant attention that it needs in this country to keep our economy healthy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will begin with a first round of questions, 5 minutes. I will start. Mr. Besek, you talked about competing in a global market and the effect that has, and being with Cargill and an emphasis that you have with pork. Can you tell me what percentage of pork in this country goes for exports?
Certainly. Senator, the pork is much larger than beef, about between 20 and 25%, depending upon the year, and about 10% of 10% of beef is exported.
And when you are looking at delays at our ports and you see other countries stepping forward and being able to fulfill some of those orders, do you know what share of the market your company has lost and how you see that a rippling effect throughout the industry?
Well, I guess going to Cargill's share gets to be a bit difficult, but if you look at the U.S. pork industry or the U.S. beef industry, we certainly have been the largest exporter around the globe. But as we have dealt with the congestion in the ports, also issues like currency and other forces in play in the market, we've seen a substantial increase just in the past year to countries, the EU, Chile, and I think certainly in the last couple months have seen a substantial decline in our volumes.
Do you think that will be a permanent decline? Will we be able to get that market back once these customers are used to having new trading partners?
I think anytime you disappoint a customer, it takes time to build trust back. And as I referred to in my testimony, there's a tremendous amount of potential for both beef and pork exports on the global scale. We have a product that the world is looking for and values. I certainly believe that growth potential remains, but there is no doubt that we've disappointed our customer base, primarily Japan, Korea, and in China, over the last couple months, and that will take some time to rebuild trust.
And in disappointing our customer base, what has been the loss in dollars to pork producers and the economy here in this country?
Well, I don't know that I'd be the best one. I think North American Meat Institute estimated $40 to $50 million per week. I could probably give you a better example. Just this morning, we have about 15 containers of chilled pork product en route to Japan that our customers are either asking, can you guarantee us that it will arrive in a useful form with shelf life or not? And so for me, that's about $1 million. I have to decide whether I'm going to put that into a port system and either slow down or potentially close, closing being a complete loss. So I hope that gives you some perspective.
Yes, thank you. And Ms. Farmer, with BNSF, I'm sure you have to look at the possibilities of a shutdown, and a shutdown that would last for a possibly extended period of time. How does that affect the railroad in planning, and what impact does that have on your customers and on your thousands of employees that you have?
Sure. So an example of this would be this weekend we were notified by the PMA that vessel gangs would not be working. And so the effect that has on our railroad is that in an average week during this period of the year, we would be moving somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 trains off of our docks in Southern California. That number has been reduced to 30 trains per week. The impact that has is that we cannot move the freight that wants to move off the West Coast. So we will move a limited amount of that freight off the West Coast into the interior of the U.S. It will then limit the ability for us to accept freight at our inland hubs. So we will have to turn freight away at those inland hubs that wants to move back to the West Coast. In addition to this, I talked about our capital expenditures that we've made. We are now having to store locomotives and equipment that we have added to our fleet to be able to handle this country's supply chain growth, store that across our railroad because we can no longer continue to send this volume out to the port. When we do that, it sits on the main line and it causes ripple effects across our network, which impact other customers in addition to our intermodal customers. So the impact for us, really, Senator Fischer, is that we cannot move the freight through it, and we are not using the valuable resources that we have.
And that impact, when you see the freight migrate from the West Coast, what impact does that have on a local community?
Absolutely. You know, I think when we look back at history and we know that during 2002, freight has permanently migrated away from that to Canada, to Mexico. And we know that because of that, the local freight is not ending up in those communities, and additional expenditures need to be made somewhere else when a port is there that could be used for that freight to be moved through the country.
Thank you very much. Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There seems to be no doubt among any of our panel members that solving this threatened impasse or crisis on the West Coast is necessary to America's near-term and longer-term competitiveness. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. But moving on to the broader issue, let me go to Mr. Gruling's really excellent testimony about our ongoing failure. And it is a kind of slow-motion implosion of American competitiveness, the ongoing failure to spend more than 2% of our GDP on infrastructure investment, which is compared to 9% by China, 8% in India, 5% in Europe, even in Mexico, 4%. It extends not only to roads and bridges, which are crumbling and decaying and decrepit, but also to areas of our infrastructure as simple as rail grade crossing. In Valhalla, New York, just days ago, we saw the consequences of possibly, we don't know the causes yet, but possibly a rail grade crossing that could have been made safer and could have prevented the deaths and injuries that occurred there. The fact of the matter is that there are more than 2,000 crashes and collisions every year at our rail grade crossings, causing more than 230 deaths and more than 700 injuries, not to mention the economic costs of those collisions, which are very difficult or impossible to calculate. That's just one example of our failure to invest in infrastructure. So let me ask you, as to the $2 billion that you recommend as a fund for investment, would it make sense to do it through a public financing authority or infrastructure bank, such as has been proposed and advocated by myself, other members of this committee, a very bipartisan proposal that would make available not just $2 billion, but very possibly more?
I think the concept of a set-aside through a public infrastructure bank, broader utilization of public and private activity bonds, along with some other finance mechanisms, I think we need to bundle these together. I think anything that costs a lot of money these days is going to take more than one source or resource to make it happen. Back in Illinois, we don't like to talk about gas tax, but we think in Illinois, to solve some of the state road and infrastructure problems, a gas tax is something we should be looking at. But I do believe that loan guarantees, broader use of some of the existing bonding programs, TIFIA and RIF, I think both would help in meeting this demand that we have. And I do believe that the multiple solutions are going to be necessary.
My understanding is that both TIFIA and RIF are underutilized. In fact, billions of dollars have been left on the table, in effect, as a result of internal problems highlighted by the Inspector General of the Department of Transportation very recently. Would you agree?
I would agree with that. I think that the time it takes to process, going through the pre-application, going through that review, the uncertainty, quite frankly, that comes about when there's long delays in public financing tools, all of a sudden the hot project becomes not so hot a project, and they start looking at some other infrastructure pieces to accomplish. Expedited review, broadening of the utilization of those funds, and certainly making sure that we're using our full complement every year would go a long way to helping us. Creating new programs is fine, but I think better utilization of existing programs makes a lot of sense.
And RIF, in fact, is a multi-billion-dollar opportunity that is lost literally every day to American intermodal transportation. I welcome the emphasis that all of our panel have put on intermodal transportation because, as you've well expressed, it is the transportation growth opportunity of the future.
That's right.
Do any of you have any differences with the points that Mr. Ruling has just made?
I would say from BNSF's perspective, certainly, we, as you well know, we're privately funded, but we certainly have a vested interest in making sure that the supply chain runs efficiently. And so therefore, we fully support a federal focus on freight. And so we think that is a good thing.
Through an infrastructure bank?
Again, we don't necessarily want to drive that decision, but we certainly want to be part of the conversation.
Thank you. My time has expired. Thank you all.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Daines.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I get to represent the state of Montana, and in Montana, our #1 industry is agriculture. It's about a $5 billion industry just last year. And as we know in ag, you have to be able to export. And like Senator Fischer, we don't have a lot of oceanfront property in Montana. Oh, I don't think Nebraska does either. And so the supply chain becomes critically important. In fact, 80% of Montana's wheat is exported. It's nearly $1 billion in 2013, and primarily through the West Coast ports. We're very proud of our ranchers and our farmers who not only feed America, they feed the world now. For Ms. Farmer, I heard concerns certainly from our producers in Montana about the backlog we had. I think a backlog of nearly 3,400 cars past due in the region. Could you tell us what the current status of the rail backlog is now in Montana?
As I have responsibility for intermodal, I'd be happy to follow up with specific statistics around the backlogs. But what I can tell you is that by any measurement on a year-over-year basis, because of the capital that we've invested, because of the milder winter that we've had, by any metric that you look at, we are far improved where we were last year. We are making significant progress towards delivering the service that your constituents in the state of Montana have come to expect from us, and we will continue to make progress along those lines. What I would say is concerning to us is that one of the ways that agricultural products get to the West Coast, as we've discussed, is through the use of containers. It can move in hopper cars or containers. And what I can say is that as we limit the inbound flow of containers into the interior of the country, it makes it more difficult for me to be able to move that product for export. And so that's certainly of concern to us.
Well, I can tell you, too, last summer, our Montana ag producers were not so concerned about the rail backlog. It was the issues going on at the West Coast ports. I used to be a supply chain guy myself. I worked for Procter & Gamble for 12 years and was in the supply chain, and have an appreciation that the chain is only as good as its weakest link. If we can't get the harvest to market, then we really cannot realize the great potential of our ag industry. The Port of Vancouver, the port and the labor dispute we had going on there that now we see going on in Long Beach and in L.A., it is having a great impact in creating dwindling confidence on, I think, our global markets, the ability for us to deliver. In thinking about our global opportunity, as our competitors continue to improve in their products, the differentiator for us long-term to win will be an excellent customer service, that ability to ensure that when we say the product's going to be there, it will be there. And as has been said, when we lose, as Senator Fischer mentioned, when we lose the ability to deliver, our customers will look elsewhere to find those same products. In fact, I just got a rather haunting email from the president of an outdoor products company that manufactures in Montana. They have leading global market share. In fact, they're the only producer of some of these products that still produce in the United States. The rest are overproducing in China. So this U.S. manufacturer, the president of the company, emailed me about his concern to what's going on as we speak today about the West Coast port slowdowns, the international longshore and warehouse unions that are putting their interests, he said, ahead of their customers. And he said this: if something doesn't happen soon, we will have no choice but to reduce our current hiring plans and potentially lay off some of our current staff. In your view, what, if anything, can be done as we look at these challenges right now with these West Coast ports being virtually either slowed down or shut down?
You know, certainly we're not party to the negotiations between the PMA and the ILWU, but it is clear to us that there needs to be some speedy resolution of this. The biggest opportunity that I think is in front of us is that it is going to take us several weeks to work off the backlogs that exist once some type of resolution comes to bear. We have an opportunity in front of us, and that is that Chinese New Year is upon us. And that will give us several weeks of reduced freight inbound to the West Coast that would allow us to catch up. So I couldn't agree with you more that it is very concerning. We need to find a way to be able to resolve this. But again, we're not party to those negotiations, and as such, you know, the urgency is really where we're focused.
Okay, thank you. Same amount of time, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Daines. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much. I'm losing my voice here, but I want to thank everyone for coming, and especially Mr. Basek from Cargill. I forget my nice companies. From Cargill, which is a great Minnesota company, biggest private company in the country, and we have worked extensively with them on these transportation issues, so thank you for being here. I'm very glad that we were able to pass the user fee increase from the River Act, and I appreciated all the work that people who transport on the river did to get that bill done. As you know, it was part of the ABLE Act. Can you talk, please, about what the increased revenue will mean for upgrading locks and dams on our nation's inland waterway system?
Senator, I'm sorry. My area of expertise is in pork exports. I know Cargill is very interested in building a strong infrastructure so that we can compete on the global scale. I'd be happy to get you a written answer from our corporate affairs staff so that we can answer that.
But you're glad that we passed the bill so you can get more infrastructure improvements? Yes. Okay, that was supposed to be an easy question, but that's okay. You know, could you talk about how this works and why it's such a problem if you're able to get things out? As Mr. Daines points out, we are states that are not on an ocean. We're on Lake Superior, and so the port matters a lot. I was once placed on the ocean subcommittee of this, the Commerce Committee, and I remember Frank Lautenberg giving me a note when I told him I was the only senator that didn't have an ocean on the ocean subcommittee, and he came back and said, well, next year, just come back and ask for one. But in any case, could you talk about how inland states depend more on this river traffic?
Absolutely. As you know, the demand for safe, wholesome food products around the world continues to increase as population increases. And we need very effective, reliable modes of transportation, whether it be a river, railroad, truck, or ocean vessel, to efficiently move those products to their best value consumer. And our farmer and rancher suppliers depend upon us to be able to take those crops and move them efficiently and get the best value so we can in turn pay them a strong value for the hard work that they do raising those crops and those livestock.
Thank you. Dr. Kempsey, could you talk about that interrelationship with the ports, and we do have the Lake Superior port, and rail and the intermodal issue?
Well, over the last 15, 20 years, the number of hours of outage, unscheduled outage at America's locks and dams, particularly on the Mississippi waterway, has increased substantially. It has made barge traffic less predictable, and agricultural shippers have been finding alternative routes. And perhaps the easiest way to see this is when you look at the Port of New Orleans' share of U.S. agricultural exports. It used to be close to 65% about 10, 15 years ago, and today it's about 45%. It is an impediment for farmers to get product down the river reliably and loaded onto the Handymax vessels. And this does create permanent damage. So rather than look at threats of job cuts or of not making investments, there are actual quantitative facts that can be assessed here. Under a free trade agreement, there are quotas for the trade of agricultural goods, corn, soy, and other grains and oilseed. And if a shipment is delayed beyond the calendar year, then the quota for that year isn't made. The importer on the other side of the trade is normally allowed some small growth rate, say 2 to 3%, but if they don't make their quota the year before, the 2 to 3% growth rate is applied to a lower base rate. The excess amount is actually filled by other countries that do have reliable systems.
Exactly, and it's going to hurt us competitively internationally. Mr. Gurling, one last question on public-private partnerships. There's the exporting of the goods, to our neighbors to the north and the south, and bringing goods in from Mexico and Canada is really important. Canada is the biggest trading partner that we have, and people don't seem to always realize that. And we are having some huge problems at the borders with delays in places like International Falls, Minnesota. There's an issue with a bridge that I'm not going to get into, which we hope is soon solved. In Windsor from Michigan, and I've been working on this as head of the interparliamentarian group with the Canadians. But on the Mexican border, our country has started to do a lot of public-private partnerships with building up the infrastructure at the ports of entry.
Right.
And so do you think this is a smart way to go? Because I want to get it rolled out on the northern border as well.
We definitely think it's a smart way to go. In our own case, we're looking at privately built bridges connecting modes of transportation, highway with rail, highway with water ports, knowing that the users will pay their fair share, knowing that that money isn't being invested into that specific infrastructure. We can't afford to build, $150 million bridges without some infusion of private equity. It's being used in North Africa. It's being used in
Canada,
the Middle East, in Canada. We have a great example down on the Ohio River of a toll bridge that was built with private equity funding. And one of the construction companies actually paid part of the bill, keep their people employed. So it is a good way, a good approach to these.
Thank you. And just to be clear, that this project is more about the customs plazas.
Right.
It's to try to speed up the back and forth between the countries with the new dawn in North America. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for having this important hearing on movement of freight. When I think of this issue, I think so much of Washington State and all the products that come through on their way to Asia. And we have, in a short period of time, seen something like a doubling in the size of the ships over the last 5 years. So yes, we have a lot more capacity, and we obviously have a rising middle class in Asia, and they want more U.S. product. So the question is, what are we going to do to meet that demand as it relates to improving our infrastructure? So one of the things that has occurred is the recommendations of the Freight Mobility Board, which was chaired by Mort Downey. I think somebody you're familiar with, Mr. Gurling, and I think Ms. Farmer, somebody from the Railroad Association at least, participated in that. The question is, how do we move forward on those recommendations, and would you support a dedicated funding source to freight so that we could raise the importance of why moving this product is so critical to our economy and infrastructure, and that Tiger alone just isn't going to get it done?
Are you asking me?
Yes,
Okay.
Ms. Farmer or Mr. Gurley. Anybody else who wants to jump in on that?
Okay. Certainly, we support anything to make our ports more competitive. We're excited about the working together of Seattle and Tacoma, so we will certainly stand together to work with them. We believe that the Tiger grants were a good thing, that we need more funding around those kinds of issues. And so from our perspective, anything we can do to make them more competitive, we're certainly in favor of that as well.
Senator, certainly our 4 points with the coalition, the number one is to establish a fully funded, dedicated freight program. And we believe that that needs to be at least $2 billion a year. And this is not a program that's going to pick winners and losers in the transportation field. This money should be spent on what makes the most economic sense in terms of performance for the entire system. And we believe that setting priorities on a national scale for the projects of national and regional significance is one of the mechanisms to do that. And also the establishment of a separate freight office within USDOT, again, to strictly focus on these multimodal needs nationally.
So what do you think that we need to do to get people to understand this from either an economic impact or some of the things that your organization has done in studying the economic development associated with this?
You know, a lot of what we do at the center and through the coalition is education. You may see this brochure that we recently produced through the coalition, Follow That Almond, and it shows the supply chain of an almond from a California grower to the port of Hamburg in Germany, delivering almond butter. And we'll have more of those in the future. I think that helps. But I also think that local jurisdictions and state jurisdictions need to understand and look at freight more on a national level and think in terms of interconnectivity, not just what's good for Elm Street or what's good for my river, but look at the whole national system and make sure that they're aware that what we do at the national level, at the local level, interconnect, and we really need to make sense of that when it comes to funding.
Mr. Bizek, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Well, the only, I guess more of a comment, Senator, you hear lots of numbers talked about, you know, $2 billion for infrastructure, and I go back to the number Senator Fischer mentioned in, you know, a port. If the ports were closed today, it'd be $2.5 billion per day to the U.S. economy. And I would submit we're very close, although they're not officially closed. I think we're very close to that at this moment. And so I guess my comment is simply it seems like a very wise investment in an expense that the U.S. Taxpayers and consumers are paying today, daily, because we don't have the free flow of goods.
Well, I think, you know, we learned the lesson in Washington because we're at the tip of the spear. And so that congestion caused so many problems that we learned that if we were going to be competitive and not lose that business, that we had to make the improvements. But now we need the improvements made all along the system, not just, you know, right there. But I think we just have to prioritize for people to understand that we will actually lose the economic impact. It's not just the upside, but there is huge upside, but there is a downside if we don't act as well. And that is that people will go to other ports or start buying product for somewhere else just because they can get more predictable time frames for its delivery. So we really need to make this investment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell. I believe we have some more time, and I know members have more questions, so we're going to do a second round. Take a big sigh here. But I'm interested, Mr. Basic and Ms. Farmer, when we look at freight transportation systems and we look at the Midwest and some of the challenges that we have with containers, how would you address those challenges where we have that lack of containers to move our product? And other members of the panel, if you'd like to jump in on that as well.
Certainly, I'll go ahead and start, Chairman Fischer. I think that what you'll see is that we've proven in normal times that we have sufficient containers to be able to move the product that wants to move export. In fact, last year we moved 236,000 units of grain in a box back to the West Coast. We work very closely with the ocean carriers and the trucking companies, and they are able to scale relatively quickly to be able to meet the demands. What BNSF has been very focused on is improving our velocity, because as you well know, that when we look at the speed with which we can turn these assets, we can create more capacity for the supply chain in the market if we invest in our infrastructure, if we have expansion in our infrastructure. So We have a very thoughtful approach to investing so that we can get the velocity that we need, which will generate the capacity for the Midwest to be able to have the containers that they need.
Anyone else?
Oh, there is a structural deficiency in that for the exports, and our exports tend to be agriculture, large-scale capital goods, and energy products. And these come from places where not a lot of people live, and therefore not a lot of containers arrive full of imported goods. So there is a structural gap that has to be addressed. And from where I sit and what I see in the data, I don't think it will be addressed very simply by trying to match or reposition containers, because every time you have these congestion issues, things do get paralyzed. It may be necessary to pursue an alternative solution, such as using 53-foot domestic containers and then doing cross-dock operations like we do with the imports, but in reverse so we can compress these onto the container ships.
Thank you. Mr. Gruber?
Senator, the demand is clearly there. Empty containers, quite frankly, are at a premium in certain locations. In our case, we're receiving grain and dried distiller's grain and corn and soybean meal from 6 different states that are being trucked in, transloaded into containers, and then shipped out on the BNSF and the UP to the West Coast. And so when you think about the cost of that transportation just to get to an empty container, shows clearly that we've got this very high demand. And really, we can't afford to build more ports. We just need to use the existing ports as efficiently as we can. And I think that applies to both inland ports and water ports. That's going to be the solution, and tie it all together with highways and railroads, and we've got a winning situation.
That ties into what I want to ask Dr. Chemesis with making our ports efficient. What role do you see for automation? Is that going to help make our ports more efficient, more competitive, and what success do you see us having in that regard?
Well, I don't think it's possible to operate the ports with the larger vessels coming without some degree of automation, if not eventually full automation. These ships, as I mentioned in testimony earlier, they have to be on the water as much as possible, not sitting at ports. So if you were to look at an 18,000 TEU vessel, which is the largest size that's really currently operating, it takes 4.5 days if you can do 35 gross moves an hour on a 24/7 basis. To maintain productivity like that without some form of automation, I think is impossible. I've yet to see it demonstrated. So we seem to have to move in that direction. If we do that, then I do see U.S. ports being able to maintain an ability to compete with foreign ports, particularly those, to our north and to the south.
Okay. Thank you, Doctor. Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you. What is the cause of the shortage of container cars in this country? I'll ask that question to whomever, or all of you, if you want to answer it.
Senator, I think from our perspective, I'm not sure there's a net shortage.
No.
I think the real issue is where the empty containers are versus where the demand for the containers is.
And what accounts for that imbalance?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the system that we have set up, the intermodal system today. We can handle over 3 million containers at our yard, 1.5 million coming in and 1.5 million going out. Places in downstate Illinois or in Minnesota or in Indiana don't have that kind of inbound capacity. Therefore, they don't have the available containers to ship out. It's a market balance to some degree. I'm not sure that's fixable in the short term. Building more containers is not necessarily the answer, and I would defer to my rail colleague here to maybe respond to that.
Ms. Farmer?
Senator Blumenthal, what I would say is that I don't believe that there's a net shortage of containers, but what we need to challenge ourselves with is how do we efficiently get them into the interior of the country. So with that, what BNSF and the Western roads have done is that we have found ways to find the ability to load those containers, consolidate grain loading around our intermodal hubs in the interior of the country. So where there's a surplus of empty containers that is naturally made by the goods that come off of the West Coast, For example, at our Logistics Park Kansas City facility, the majority of grain that gets loaded out, or a very large percentage of the grain that gets loaded out, comes from the state of Kansas. And so as we can draw that closer to our logistics parks, we then have the empty containers there that can then be loaded out. And in addition to that, we have to keep continuing to invest so that our velocity is good, so that the containers are there. So I don't think in total that there's a net shortage. The issue is about how do we stay competitive through the ports, over the railroads, into the right places to be able to get those containers into the interior of the country.
But the ports are just one key to a multimodal system.
Absolutely.
Where rail is obviously very important to moving a lot of those containers to the right places so they can be there at the right time.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you, you know, going back to the infrastructure investment issue, and Mr. Besick mentioned this figure of $2 billion, the possible loss of $2 billion if this impasse or crisis continues, which would be very, very, very unfortunate. But it strikes me as an example of how possibly there are costs to lack of recognizing the importance of investment and smart policy. So what somewhat perplexes me is why the folks who run our transportation system, including your railroad and others who are here, have not been more vociferous or vehement advocates of specific solutions to these infrastructure problems in the way that maybe will move policymakers, including folks who are sitting on this panel, to take some action. In other words, we'd welcome you to be more vigorous advocates for the system that is your responsibility and trust to run, and ultimately your shareholders have very significant investments in.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned earlier, Senator Blumenthal, we agree from the standpoint that we absolutely have to continue to manage our network, invest in capital expenditures that make sense going forward. We also want to, we have a vested interest in remaining engaged in that conversation. We believe that a national transportation policy is a good thing with a focus on freight. And so I think that we've been very active relative to those discussions and participation in national transportation policy planning.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Daines.
There's a follow-up question, and thank you, Madam Chair, regarding infrastructure investment. And Senator Blumenthal, I completely agree that we need to continue investing here if we're going to maintain our global competitiveness. I think, Ms. Farmer, you mentioned about some of the roadblocks of proposed export facilities we're experiencing on the West Coast. I was out at one of those proposed facilities last summer, the Gateway Pacific Terminal. I was standing there with a member of the rail union from Montana. I was standing there with a tribal member from Montana that would benefit from expanded exports. We see both the jobs as well as the tax revenues that would be created by expanding exports. And yet, it's delay after delay after delay in trying to get this port built. And it sits literally right in between two existing ports. It's zoned properly. It's environmentally sound. And yet, there's great concern that how in the world are we ever going to move forward here in infrastructure investment with these endless delays and uncertainty. I'm looking for help here around what we can do to try to, I'm not suggesting there's not a thorough review process, but one that provides some degree of certainty and reasonability in that process. Ms. Farmer, any comments on that, thoughts?
Well, I would say, Senator, we certainly agree. We are working very closely, as you know, with the state of Montana to put together our export platform. We, like you, are anxious to have the ability to continue to grow, to be able to export. You know, we believe that there needs to be some improvement, whether it's around permitting reform. We've talked about that multiple times in the past. We believe that extending the environmental review position of MAP 21 to the railroads would be helpful, and you know, further expediting the process, looking at these things concurrently. basically reducing the timeline that these things take. But in general, what I would say is that we completely agree that we are anxious to export product, to continue to grow, to improve the competitiveness of the U.S. supply chain, both through exports and what we've talked about here, as well as imports as well.
And I think Mr. Kemish talked about the need for the state-of-the-art productivity and automation and so forth. This proposed port would be exactly that. And Mr. Grueling, what are your thoughts on that? I know you're somewhat an expert on this issue.
Senator, I think much like we suffer from multiple jurisdictionitis with 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 governmental units controlling roads and infrastructure, the federal government has the same issue for these major projects, the number of agencies that these projects have to touch, the time it takes to go through the NEPA process, the environmental review. In fact, I would comment that we have actually seen some improvement on that under leadership from Congress and the administration, and we applaud that. It shouldn't take 10, 12 years to do an EIS statement on a bridge. Clearly, that is an issue. So multiple agencies maybe working a little closer together on collaboration. And again, we think a national freight office could help sort of quarterback that initiative, especially for these major important freight projects.
Well, I think what's highlighted today in some of the testimony is what's happened with these choke points on our West Coast ports, allowing more optionality, so forth here to resolve these issues when they come up. If we only have one way out, it's nice to have multiple choices here and so forth to ensure we protect our economic interests and can continue to compete globally. So, I think it's all the question I have.
Thank you, Senator Daines. We've been joined by the chair of the committee, Senator Thune. Do you have questions, please?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Senator Blumenthal, thanks for holding this hearing. It's a very important subject, and I appreciate the fact that your subcommittee is focused on this. A reliable and efficient supply chain is critical to our global competitiveness and to our economy, and the ports are an absolutely vital link in that chain. And what's frustrating is that some of these things are things sometimes you can't control. These things are sort of, I'd say, self-imposed problems. They're really kind of unforced errors, and they are, if you try and quantify this, it's having a profound impact on the economy. And I know some of you in the panel have already testified to that effect. Cargill, the $40 million a week. I've talked with Tyson's in my state in South Dakota, and they've shared with me that we've got beef and pork sitting in freezers near the ports instead of heading to Asian markets. And while we've got all these large container ships sitting off the coast waiting to export our nation's products, and that affects jobs. You know, Tyson's employs 41,000 people. That USDA estimates there are 1 million jobs associated with agricultural exports in this country, and so it has a profound impact on the economy, not just on the West Coast, but all across the country, and workers in South Dakota and other places that are dependent upon, like I said, a reliable supply chain. Outdoor Gear Inc., family-owned business in South Dakota. They're a wholesaler. Receives 95% of its inventory from West Coast ports, has been forced to miss deadlines, pay for late delivery penalties, and pass up important sales opportunities, including in December, which is, of course, the holiday peak season. So this is an issue that just really needs our focus, and it's a huge drain on the economy, and I just urge all sides to come to a resolution in this dispute, to find a solution as soon as possible. We just can't afford to drag this on and have our economy pay this kind of a price. And if we can get this behind us, we can start focusing our energy and creativity on a lot of the other long-term infrastructure challenges that desperately need our attention as well. In that light, I wanted to ask a question. I know that I think all of you have attempted to kind of quantify what some of the financial and economic impacts of this have been, but the question I'd like to pose is, once this is resolved, how long will it take to unwind this and to get those networks working in an efficient way again, and where things are sort of normalized? And what are we talking about once we get hopefully, which will be very soon, a resolution to this issue?
So, Senator, I'd answer from our side as the exporter. I think it's an excellent question. Our best estimate is on chilled shipments, it will take at least a month to get back into a normal flow when we can get those products moving through to the high-value markets in Japan and Korea, at least a month. If you move over to the frozen side, the products that we would send to Japan, Korea, China, Mideast, are all around the globe. Our best estimate is 3 to 4 months before we're back to a normal flow. We've moved through the backlog of goods that we have, and that number continues to increase every day.
Senator Thune, from our perspective at the railroad, we certainly stand ready to be able to help the backlog, but what I would say is because of the challenges that we've faced with not being able to move freight, we have had to store locomotives and equipment across our network. And so there will be some period of time that it will take for us to be able to go and get those assets, reposition them to the port, be able to be in position to handle that. But what I would tell you is we are anxiously awaiting the ability to do that. We will be ready to do that. We have a unique opportunity, as I mentioned earlier before you stepped in that Chinese New Year is coming. And when Chinese New Year hits, we will see less vessels that will be headed towards the West Coast. It would give us an opportunity, if there was a speedy resolution to this current PMA ILWU negotiations, that we could use that time then to work off the backlog that exists at the ports.
Well, I guess I would just reiterate, Madam Chair, and again, thank you for having this hearing, that this is not something that's confined to the West Coast. This has a ripple effect throughout our entire economy. Having an efficient transportation system is really one of the keys to our advantage, our competitive advantage in the global economy. And so when you see this kind of thing happen and recognize the impacts that it has, I would just again encourage all the parties to create a new sense of urgency and build some intensity behind coming to a resolution. We just can't continue to keep this going on and not expect that it's going to have some very, very detrimental and adverse impacts on a whole range of sectors of our economy and on all the jobs that go with it. So, Madam Chair, thank you, and thank the panel for your great testimony today.
Thank you, Chairman Thune. Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Senator Fischer, for holding this hearing, and you and Senator Blumenthal for drawing attention to this issue. I know a lot of questions have already been asked. On the, Dr. Kempsis, in your written testimony, you mentioned that the underinvestment in the Mississippi ports, the inland ports, indicates that we've been more import-oriented than export-oriented. Would you just expand for a few minutes on the significance of the inland ports, particularly with the Panama Canal development and agriculture opportunities and trade as well as manufacturing?
And most of the growth in trade was on the import side, and when we look at the various segments of the freight movement industry in the U.S., the larger projects that were done by rail, by highway, and at the port level, they were focused on being able to handle the imports more efficiently. A lot of the dredging, for instance, is not really done because we were trying to export more goods. Our goods are very heavy. They require deeper draft vessels, but the motivation, when you read the economic analysis or the cost-benefit analysis, was essentially focused on the import side. And maybe you can look at it from that side to say, well, this is an import bias in our investments. But if we look at the projects or where we haven't had funding for infrastructure, you get the same message. And that's what I meant in the testimony about the Mississippi Waterway. We have seen chronic and consistent underfunding, and we've seen a deterioration of the infrastructure there.
Well, I think from the locks to the ports themselves and, you know, obviously I'd be very focused on the Mississippi River because of where I live and where I've grown up and where we are today. But, you know, the inland ports also serve a geographic area logically twice as big as the coastal ports because you serve a geographic area both ways. And I hope we can begin to focus more on those ports. The other question I had, Chairman, for Ms. Farmer, I think you all have been trying BNSF for a long time to do a California project, the California International Gateway, Permitting delays have been a big problem there. I'm working on some legislation now to try to streamline permitting for railroad projects. Do you want to talk about how the kind of problems you've had trying to serve that market in a better way?
Absolutely. So Southern California International Gateway would be, as I've mentioned, the greenest intermodal facility in the world when built. We've been working for a decade to try to do this. We've faced local opposition, and what I would say is that that is indicative of projects that we see across our network. So it's not just the Southern California International Gateway project. We really are in favor of permitting reform, and I know and I appreciate your leadership in this area. As I spoke to earlier, we really believe that extending the environmental review position of MAP 21 to the railroads would be a great first step. We believe that it's important to shorten the timeframes. We know that we're not trying to eliminate the review process. We're just asking that there be a reasonable time. We need to shorten the time frame, that the agencies could possibly look at the things concurrently as opposed to sequentially. And so it's just important for us that we are able to move forward the projects that will add capacity to this supply chain.
May I make a comment on that? We're the program managers for the Jasper Ocean Terminal on the Savannah River. And in the report that we gave the board last year, we pointed out that if we were to start the application process, then it would be 13 years before the port could become actually, turnkey operational. And then we have to justify this on the basis of analysis. So I have the unfortunate position of having to forecast what volumes will go through a port that doesn't exist in 13 years. So I think this is an example of how far the process has basically gotten off kilter.
Either of the other two of you want to comment on that topic, Mr. Gurley?
I would, Senator, thank you. What's interesting about this discussion about freight movement and the problems we have in this country, it's all about choke points, whether it be a problem at the ports, whether it be congestion on the highways, whether it be at-grade closing for a rail crossing, whether it be an extended period of time to get permitted for a project. Those are all choke points. And what's unfortunate about that is America has a distinct and very unique advantage in this global marketplace. And to think that our transportation system is one of the primary reasons that we're being held back both on imports, but more importantly on exports, it's almost criminal. It's a shame. And I think that there's a lot that we can do better to help with that situation.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blunt. Any other questions from the senators? Well, with that, I would say this hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks, and during this time, senators are asked to submit any questions for the record. Upon receipt, the witnesses are requested to submit their written answers to the committee as soon as possible. With that, I conclude the hearing. I thank the witnesses for just a great responses here and the information that you provided us today. Thank you so much. The hearing is closed.